Tôi sẽ viết lại toàn bộ câu chuyện với tên mới, chia thành 3 phần. Đây là phần 1. Michael Carter's shoulder hit the concrete floor of Amazon Fulfillment Center, SEA7, at exactly 5:47 a.m. The 80-pound pallet he'd been pushing, finally winning the battle gravity, had been waging for the last 6 hours. Pain exploded through his left side, sharp enough to cut through the exhaustion fogging his brain, but he forced himself upright before any of the supervisors noticed. $340 sat folded in his vest pocket. 2 weeks of wages reduced to cash because Emma's prescription didn't take credit cards at the discount pharmacy on Rainier Avenue. The pain didn't matter. The shift ending in 13 minutes mattered. Getting that money to Bartell Drugs before they opened at 7 mattered. The phone in his other pocket vibrated once, then again, then erupted into the ringtone he'd assigned to Seattle Children's Hospital. Michael felt his stomach drop through the floor beneath him as he fumbled the device out with hands that suddenly refused to cooperate properly. A woman's voice he didn't recognize explained in careful clinical tones that Emma had collapsed during morning recess at Garfield Elementary, that the school nurse had called 911, that the ambulance was transporting her to the emergency room right now, that he should come immediately. He hit the turnstile at full speed, setting off the alarm because he hadn't clocked out, hadn't followed procedure, hadn't done any of the things that kept a man employed at a job that paid $42,000 a year. Behind him, someone shouted his name, probably the shift supervisor, probably telling him he was fired. Michael didn't slow down. The parking lot spread out before him in the pre-dawn darkness, his 2007 Honda Civic waiting in the back row where it always waited. He'd bought it used 3 years ago with the last check from Sarah's life insurance, the one item he'd let himself purchase after paying for the funeral and setting aside money for Emma's medication. The driver's side door stuck in cold weather, requiring a specific combination of pulling and hip checking that he'd perfected through repetition. And even now, his body executed the familiar choreography without conscious thought. The engine turned over on the second try. Michael reversed out of the space and pressed the accelerator harder than the old 4-cylinder really wanted to handle. Pike Street at 5:52 in the morning meant limited traffic, meant he could make most of the lights if he timed them right, meant he might reach the hospital before they took Emma into surgery or pronounced her dead, or delivered whatever news waited for fathers who couldn't afford the medication that kept defective hearts beating. The first red light caught him at Madison. Michael gripped the steering wheel hard enough to make his knuckles ache, counting seconds, watching cross-traffic that didn't exist. Sarah had made him promise 3 things before the cancer took her, before she'd wasted away to nothing in a hospice bed, while Emma drew pictures in the corner and pretended not to understand that Mommy wasn't coming home. Keep Emma safe. That was promise number 1. Don't let grief make you hard, number 2. And number 3, spoken so quietly he'd almost missed it. Find love again if you meet someone worthy. I give you permission. 3 years later, Michael had managed the first promise through a combination of willpower and sacrifice. The second promise he broke a little bit every day, feeling pieces of himself calcify because softness was a luxury he couldn't afford, when the alternative was watching his daughter die from lack of money. The third promise he'd buried so deep it only surfaced in dreams the light changed. Michael accelerated through the intersection, made it 2 more blocks before the next signal caught him at Pike. Somewhere to his left, the sun was starting its slow climb over the Cascades, painting the underbelly of clouds in shades of amber and rose. The vest pocket holding $340 felt heavy, accusatory. He should have bought the medication yesterday. Should have skipped his own meals for another week. Should have done something other than gamble that Emma's heart would keep beating for 48 more hours. A scream cut through the dawn quiet, high and sharp and undeniably human. Michael's foot hit the brake before his conscious mind registered the sound. The traffic light ahead glowed red, giving him permission to ignore what he'd heard. But the scream came again, closer now, and Michael's head turned toward the source despite every rational impulse telling him to look away. The alley mouth between a closed dry cleaner and a shuttered pawn shop revealed itself in the growing light. Two men in dark jackets dragged a woman backward into shadow, her heels scrabbling against pavement as she fought to break free. One of the men had his hand clamped over her mouth. The other held something that caught the light, a knife. 47 people walked past on the opposite sidewalk, heads down, eyes locked on phones, feet moving at the carefully calibrated pace of commuters who had learned that the best response to violence was accelerated indifference. Michael looked at his watch, 5:53 a.m. Looked at the hospital, still 7 blocks away. Looked at Emma's prescription money in his vest pocket. Looked at the alley where the woman had stopped screaming. "Don't let grief make you hard," Sarah's voice in his memory whispering the second promise with lungs that barely worked. Emma sitting in the corner of that hospice room, 8 feet away but a universe distant, drawing pictures while her mother spent her last conscious moments making her husband swear oaths he didn't know if he could keep. Michael killed the engine, pulled the keys from the ignition, stepped out onto Pike Street while his rational mind screamed objections about daughters in hospitals and medications that cost $340. The vest came off as he crossed the street, folded carefully to protect the money inside, placed on the Civic's hood where he could see it. Then he was moving toward the alley, toward the screaming that had stopped, toward the choice that would either save one life or cost another. The first man didn't see him coming. Michael's shoulder caught him in the lower back, driving him forward into the brick wall hard enough to produce a sound like a gunshot. The man went down, the knife skittering away across pavement. The second man released the woman and spun toward this new threat, hands coming up in a fighting stance that suggested training Michael didn't possess. But Michael had 80 pounds on him and 3 years of grief-powered rage that needed somewhere to go. And when the man threw the first punch, Michael simply walked through it, accepting the impact against his jaw as the price for getting close enough to grab the front of the man's jacket and drive his forehead into the bridge of the man's nose. The woman ran. Michael registered her fleeing shape in his peripheral vision, heard her heels clicking against pavement as she escaped toward safety. Good, one objective accomplished. Now he just needed to get out before the 2 men recovered. The first man wasn't down anymore. He'd found the knife again, was rising from the pavement with the blade held low and professional. Michael backed away, hands up, looking for anything he could use as a weapon. The alley offered garbage bags and broken bottles and nothing that would stop 6 inches of steel from finding vital organs. The blade came up fast, aimed at Michael's midsection. Michael twisted left, felt the point catch his vest, felt resistance as the fabric tore. He grabbed for the man's wrist, missed, caught jacket sleeve instead. They stumbled together deeper into the alley. The second man joined the fight, fists hammering into Michael's back, his kidneys, the base of his skull. The vest tore completely, falling away to hang from Michael's left arm. The knife came in again, and this time Michael didn't dodge fast enough. He felt the blade punch through the meat of his shoulder, felt it grind against bone, felt heat that turned to ice, that turned to numbness. Blood flowered across his white undershirt, spreading in a pattern that would have been beautiful if it hadn't belonged to him. But he didn't let go of the jacket. His right hand maintained its grip even as his left arm stopped responding to commands. The man with the knife pulled backward, trying to create distance. Michael went with him, accepting gravity's invitation to fall if falling meant buying enough time for the woman to get away. They hit the pavement together, Michael on bottom, taking the impact across his back and skull. Stars burst in his vision. The knife came up one more time, and Michael knew with absolute certainty that he'd miscalculated, that Emma would grow up without a father because her father had been stupid enough to think he could save strangers when he couldn't even save his own daughter. Then sirens cut through the dawn, close and getting closer. The pressure on Michael's chest disappeared as both men decided that whatever they'd planned wasn't worth staying to finish. Footsteps receded toward the alley's far end. Michael tried to push himself upright, made it to his elbows before his left arm buckled and deposited him back on the ground. The woman appeared above him, backlit by streetlights, so her face remained in shadow. She'd come back. Her voice reached him through the ringing in his ears, asking questions he couldn't quite parse, saying things about ambulances and holding pressure and staying awake. Michael tried to explain about Emma and the hospital and the $340, but his mouth wouldn't cooperate. The sirens resolved into squad cars, 2 of them blocking both ends of the alley. Officers approached with hands on weapons, shouting commands. The woman spoke for him, explaining about the attack, about Michael's intervention, about the 2 men who'd fled. Someone pressed something against Michael's shoulder, producing fresh agony that cleared his head enough to remember what mattered. Emma. He needed to get to Emma. Michael forced the words out through teeth he didn't remember clenching. Hospital. Daughter. Emergency. The woman nodded, said something to the nearest officer, then turned back to Michael with an expression he couldn't quite read. She told him her name was Lisa, that she worked in marketing, that she was calling her car service to take him to Swedish Medical Center. Michael tried to object, tried to explain that the Civic would be fine once he could stand. But Lisa was already making calls, speaking in the clipped tones of someone accustomed to having instructions followed without question. 2 minutes later, a black Mercedes sedan pulled to the curb. The vest lay forgotten in the alley. Michael lunged back toward it, ignoring the pain that lanced through his shoulder. $340. Emma's medication. He retrieved the vest, clutched it against his chest with his good arm, let himself be maneuvered into the Mercedes only after confirming the money remained secure. Lisa slid in beside him, gave the driver an address Michael recognized as Swedish Medical's emergency entrance. She pulled a scarf from her purse, silk, expensive, and pressed it against his shoulder without asking permission. The pressure hurt badly enough to make him gasp, but it slowed the bleeding. She asked questions. Was he okay? Did he need anything? Why had he stopped to help when 47 other people had kept walking? Michael tried to explain about promises made to dying wives and daughters who deserved fathers who stayed soft enough to care about strangers. But exhaustion was catching up to him now, making forming sentences feel like climbing mountains. So instead he asked about her, deflecting attention the way he'd learned to deflect concern whenever Mrs. Anderson brought casseroles. Lisa told him she'd been walking to an early meeting, that the 2 men had appeared from nowhere, that she'd honestly thought she was going to die in that alley until Michael had crashed into them like some kind of guardian angel. She said it lightly like a joke, but Michael heard the tremor underneath. The Mercedes turned onto Madison, heading east toward First Hill. Michael checked his watch, 6:15 a.m. 28 minutes since the hospital had called. 28 minutes that Emma had spent alone, possibly dying, definitely scared, while her father chose to save a stranger instead of keeping the first promise he'd made to Sarah. Lisa was still talking, filling the silence with words that Michael absorbed without processing. She mentioned something about reward money, about wanting to repay him for saving her life, about connections she had that could help with medical bills. Michael shook his head, the motion making his vision swim. He didn't save people for money. The Mercedes pulled up to the emergency entrance where an ambulance sat empty. Rear doors standing open. Lisa helped Michael out of the car, shouldering more of his weight than he wanted to accept, guiding him through automatic doors into the familiar chaos of a hospital emergency room at dawn. Michael approached the intake desk, already forming words to explain about Emma. But the nurse took one look at his blood-soaked shirt and was already calling for immediate assistance. Michael tried to object, tried to push past toward the pediatric wing where Emma would be. A familiar voice stopped him mid-protest. Dr. Jennifer Walsh emerged from one of the curtained bays, her expression shifting from professional concern to something like recognition as she registered Michael's face. She'd been in touch after Sarah died, calling every few months to check on Emma's heart condition, offering advice about specialists and procedures. Doctor. Walsh looked at Michael, then at Lisa, then back at Michael with an expression that suggested she was calculating variables he couldn't see. She opened her mouth to say something, probably to greet Lisa by name, but Lisa's hand tightened on Michael's good arm in a grip that communicated urgent warning. Dr. Walsh's mouth closed. She nodded once, then turned her attention fully to Michael's shoulder. They moved him to a bay, stripped away the ruined shirt, irrigated the wound with solution that burned worse than the original injury. Dr. Walsh worked in silence, placing sutures with precision that came from thousands of repetitions. Lisa hovered nearby, watching the procedure with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to their brief acquaintance. Michael tried to ask about Emma again. Dr. Walsh tied off the final suture before answering, her voice carefully neutral. Emma was stable, resting in a pediatric bay, being monitored by cardiology. The collapse had been serious, but not immediately life-threatening. They'd stabilized her heart rhythm with medication. And yes, Michael could see her now. Relief hit Michael hard enough to make his vision blur. Emma was alive. Not dead, not dying. Alive and stable and waiting for him. Dr. Walsh finished dressing the wound, gave Michael instructions about keeping it clean and watching for signs of infection. Then she was guiding him down corridors toward the pediatric wing where children too young to understand their own mortality waited for parents to make impossible choices. Emma sat propped up in a hospital bed that made her look even smaller than 8 years old. An IV line running into her left arm, monitors tracking her heartbeat and steady electronic beeps. She'd been drawing, graphite pencil moving across sketch paper despite the IV, despite the weakness that made her hand tremble. The pencil had belonged to Sarah, one of a set his wife had used for portrait work. Emma had claimed them after the funeral, had taught herself to draw by copying her mother's techniques. She looked up when Michael entered, and the relief in her eyes was so profound it nearly broke him. He crossed to the bed, wrapped his good arm around her carefully, trying not to dislodge the IV. She felt fragile in his embrace, all bird bones and fierce heartbeat. He whispered apologies against her hair. Sorry for being late. Sorry for not being there when she collapsed. Emma just held on tighter, her voice muffled against his chest. I knew you'd come. You always come. Lisa stood in the doorway watching the reunion with an expression Michael couldn't identify. Dr. Walsh had disappeared, leaving them privacy. Emma noticed the blood, pulled back with concern, sharpening her features into something too adult for an 8-year-old face. Michael tried to downplay it, tried to explain about stopping to help someone, but Emma's eyes had already moved past him to Lisa, taking in the expensive clothes and careful makeup. She asked who the lady was, her voice carrying the slightly possessive tone she used whenever unfamiliar women appeared in her father's vicinity. Lisa introduced herself before Michael could, stepping into the room with a smile that seemed genuine. She said her name was Lisa, that she worked in marketing, that Michael had helped her this morning and she wanted to make sure he was okay. The lies came smoothly, delivered with practiced ease. Emma studied Lisa with the intensity she normally reserved for subjects she was trying to draw, cataloging details, making judgments. Whatever she found must have passed inspection because Emma nodded, accepting the explanation, returning her attention to the sketch she'd been working on. Lisa moved closer, asking about the drawing with genuine interest. Emma showed her a portrait of a woman who might have been Sarah. They talked about art techniques and shading. Lisa knew things about drawing that surprised Michael, mentioned artists he'd never heard of, pointed out details in Emma's work. Emma responded with animated enthusiasm she rarely showed strangers, explaining her process, showing Lisa other sketches hidden under the bed. Michael watched this interaction with growing confusion, trying to reconcile the woman who'd needed saving with the woman currently discussing Renaissance techniques with his 8-year-old daughter. Something didn't align. Lisa's hands were too steady, her knowledge too specialized, her entire presence too composed for someone who'd nearly been murdered 20 minutes ago. A nurse appeared to check Emma's vitals. Dr. Walsh returned with papers Michael needed to sign. Insurance forms that would be rejected and bills that would accumulate. He signed everything with his right hand, while his left shoulder throbbed, making promises with his signature that his bank account couldn't keep. Lisa excused herself, saying something about needing to make calls. She left a business card on the bedside table, simple white cardstock with a phone number but no name. Michael pocketed it without looking. The tests showed Emma's heart was deteriorating faster than anyone had predicted. They needed surgery, a complete repair of the septal defect, replacement of damaged valves. Cost $180,000, timeline 4 months maximum before Emma's heart gave out completely. Dr. Walsh delivered this information in the careful monotone doctors used when the news was catastrophic. Michael didn't break down, couldn't afford to, not in front of Emma. He asked about payment plans, about financial assistance, about clinical trials. Dr. Walsh had answers for everything, all of them variations on "we'll try our best, but you should prepare yourself for the possibility that we can't save her without money you don't have." Emma went back to her drawing, pretending not to listen, pretending the conversation wasn't about her death scheduled for sometime in the next 16 weeks. The pencil moved across paper in confident strokes, creating something beautiful while the adults discussed failure in careful euphemisms. Keep Emma safe. That was the first promise, the one that mattered more than his pride or his self-sufficiency. $180,000 stood between his daughter and the grave. Dr. Walsh left to consult with the cardiologist. Michael and Emma sat in sterile quiet, listening to monitors beep. Emma showed him the finished portrait, Sarah smiling the way she'd smiled before cancer had stolen her ability to smile. He asked Emma where she'd learned to capture light like that. Emma said, "Mom taught me." Her voice matter-of-fact, like having a dead mother instruct you through inherited muscle memory, was natural. She said Mom came in dreams sometimes, showed her techniques. She said Mom promised everything would be okay, that Dad would figure it out. Michael didn't believe in ghosts or dreams, but he believed Emma believed, and that belief gave his daughter comfort his empty reassurances never could. So he nodded, agreed that Sarah was watching over them. The phone in Michael's pocket vibrated with a notification. He pulled it out, expecting a message from Amazon confirming his termination. Instead, he found a text from an unknown number. "This is Lisa. I know you said no to the reward money, but please let me help with Emma's medical bills. No one should have to choose between pride and their child's life." The message included a phone number. He deleted the text without responding, pocketed the phone, returned his attention to Emma, who'd started a new drawing, this one of 3 figures holding hands, a man and a woman and a child. The morning stretched toward afternoon. Nurses came and went. Dr. Walsh returned with more papers, more signatures required. Emma's heart continued beating, the monitors translating life into electronic pulses, buying time Michael didn't know how to use. At some point, Lisa came back, bringing food Michael didn't remember asking for. Sandwiches from a deli, coffee that tasted expensive. She sat with them while Emma ate, not pushing conversation, just existing in the space. Emma asked her questions about work and drawing and whether Lisa had ever been to the Space Needle. Lisa answered everything with patience that seemed genuine, showed Emma pictures on her phone, promised to take Emma there someday if Michael said it was okay. Michael should have objected, should have established boundaries, But Emma was smiling for the first time since collapsing, and Lisa wasn't treating his daughter like a charity case or anything other than a person worth knowing. So Michael stayed quiet, listening to his daughter laugh, watching Lisa become something that looked almost like family. When visiting hours ended, Lisa left without protest. She said goodbye to Emma with warmth that seemed disproportionate to their brief acquaintance, promised to visit again if Michael didn't mind, pressed another business card into Michael's hand. This card was different, heavier stock, embossed lettering, a name that finally told the truth. Elizabeth Bennett, Chief Executive Officer, Bennett Medical Supply. Michael stared at the card for a long moment, watching expensive ink catch the fluorescent light. She'd lied, not just about her name, but about everything. Her job, her status. The woman he'd saved wasn't some random marketing employee. She was someone important enough to carry business cards that cost more to print than Michael spent on groceries. Elizabeth must have seen the realization cross his face because she spoke quickly. She'd wanted to thank him properly without the weight of obligation, that she'd hidden her identity because people acted differently around CEOs, that the offer to help with Emma's medical bills was still open if Michael would reconsider. Michael handed the card back without a word, watched her fingers close around it, watched her expression shift from hope to disappointment before settling into careful neutrality. She nodded once, then turned and walked out with the kind of dignity that probably came naturally to people who ran companies. Emma asked who that really was. He told her the truth, that Lisa was actually Elizabeth Bennett, that she ran a medical supply company, that she was rich and powerful and not someone who belonged in their world. Emma considered this while studying the drawing she'd made earlier. Then she said something that made Michael's chest tighten. I liked her better when she was just Lisa. Rich people are usually mean. Michael couldn't argue with that assessment, so he just agreed, told Emma she was right to be cautious, promised that Elizabeth wouldn't be coming back to visit. 3 days later, an envelope arrived at Michael's apartment. No return address, just his name written in careful script on expensive paper. Inside, a check for $5,000 and a note that read, "For Emma's medication. Not charity, just evening the scales. You gave me my life. Let me give your daughter more time with hers." Michael tore the check into pieces small enough to flush down the toilet. Called the number on Elizabeth's business card, ready to tell her exactly where she could put her money and her guilt. The call went to voicemail, a professional recording that identified the line as belonging to the office of Elizabeth Bennett, CEO of Bennett Medical Supply. Michael hung up without leaving a message, threw the business card in the trash, tried to forget the whole interaction had ever happened. But Emma's medication ran out a week later, and Michael's bank account showed $217 against a $340 prescription. He stood in Bartell Drugs Pharmacy with a bottle he couldn't afford, making calculations that all ended the same way: not enough money. The pharmacist watched him with sympathy that made Michael want to break something, asked if he wanted to put the medication on credit, knowing the answer, offering anyway. Michael put the medication back on the counter, said he'd come back tomorrow, knowing tomorrow wouldn't change the math, walked out into Seattle drizzle with empty hands and a phone that felt heavy in his pocket. He made it halfway home before turning around. Made it back to the pharmacy before talking himself out of it. Stood in the rain trying to decide which promise mattered more, the one about keeping Emma safe or the one he'd made to himself about never accepting handouts. The phone rang 3 times before someone answered. Not Elizabeth, some assistant. Michael asked to speak to Elizabeth Bennett, said it was about the check she'd sent, tried to keep his voice level. Elizabeth came on the line 30 seconds later, her voice careful, like she expected him to yell. Michael didn't yell, just said 3 words that cost him more than the $180,000 Emma needed. "I'll take it. De la fan high. Soon." The check cleared on Thursday, depositing $5,000 into an account that had never held more than $800 at one time. Michael stood at the Wells Fargo ATM on Rainier Avenue, watching the balance update on the screen, feeling like he'd sold something he couldn't name for currency that spent the same as any other money, but somehow felt different in his hands. The pharmacist at Bartell Drugs didn't ask questions when Michael returned with cash for Emma's medication. Just counted out pills into an orange bottle and wished him a good day, like this transaction was identical to every other transaction. Elizabeth called that evening while Michael was heating leftover spaghetti that Emma wouldn't eat because the medication made everything taste like metal. Her voice came through the phone speaker with careful neutrality. She wanted to meet tomorrow if Michael had time, wanted to discuss something that might help with Emma's situation beyond just the medication money. Michael almost said no, almost ended the call and blocked the number. But Emma was getting thinner despite the medication, sleeping 16 hours a day instead of 12, drawing fewer pictures because holding the pencil required energy her failing heart couldn't spare. So Michael said yes, agreed to meet at a coffee shop in Capitol Hill on his lunch break from the warehouse job he no longer had. The coffee shop Elizabeth chose occupied a converted brownstone on Broadway, the kind of place that charged $7 for drinks in cups without lids. Michael arrived 15 minutes early, spent 10 of those minutes sitting in his car rehearsing the speech he'd prepared about accepting the medication money but refusing anything else. He walked through the door at exactly noon carrying those prepared words like armor. She sat at a corner table dressed in jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than Michael's monthly rent but didn't advertise wealth the way her CEO suit had. No makeup, hair pulled into a simple ponytail, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug. She stood when he approached, offered her hand for a shake that felt absurdly formal given she'd already seen him bleeding in an alley. Her grip was firm, brief. They sat. A barista appeared with a menu Michael didn't want. Elizabeth ordered for both of them, black coffee for him, Earl Grey for herself, nothing fancy. The barista disappeared. Elizabeth folded her hands on the table and began speaking in a voice stripped of the polish Michael had heard on her office voicemail. She told him about the 4 pregnancies, the 4 losses, the 6 years of trying to create life while her body systematically rejected every attempt. Week 8, week 12, week 16, week 18. An ascending timeline of hope followed by devastation. The last loss had been Grace, the daughter who'd made it furthest, who'd died inside Elizabeth while Elizabeth sat in a board meeting discussing quarterly projections. She'd finished the meeting before driving herself to the hospital, maintaining composure through the procedure, returning to work 3 days later because what else was there to do when grief had no outlet? Michael listened without interrupting, recognizing the shape of this confession even if the details differed from his own experience with loss. Elizabeth wasn't asking for sympathy. She was explaining the context that made saving Emma's life something more than charity, something closer to desperate need. When Michael had stopped to help her, he'd given Elizabeth something she hadn't felt since losing Grace, the sense that her continued existence served a purpose beyond generating shareholder value. The coffee arrived. Michael wrapped his hands around the cup, buying time to formulate a response. But Elizabeth kept talking, moving from past losses to the offer she'd brought him here to make. She wanted to help with Emma's surgery, not as charity but as exchange. In return for the $180,000 Michael couldn't provide, Elizabeth asked only to be allowed in Emma's life, to experience some shadow of motherhood through proximity to a child who wasn't hers, but who might accept her presence anyway. The request landed in Michael's chest like a punch. Elizabeth wasn't offering a loan or a donation. She was asking to buy her way into his family, to trade her wealth for access to the one thing her money couldn't manufacture, a child who might love her. Michael's first instinct was refusal, immediate and absolute. Emma wasn't for sale, wasn't some commodity to be exchanged for surgery funding. But refusing meant watching Emma die, meant breaking the first promise to Sarah. He opened his mouth to say no anyway. The words stuck in his throat, trapped behind the image of Emma growing thinner and weaker. Elizabeth must have seen the refusal forming because she spoke quickly, clarifying terms. She wasn't asking to replace Sarah or claim Emma as her own. She just wanted permission to be present, to help where help was needed. If that meant paying for surgery, wonderful. If it meant sitting in hospital rooms, she'd do that too. If it meant nothing more than occasional visits where she got to watch Emma draw, that would be enough. Michael drank his coffee, buying time, trying to calculate costs and benefits in a situation where every option felt like betrayal. Accepting meant allowing a stranger into Emma's life, meant exposing his daughter to the possibility of attachment followed by inevitable loss when Elizabeth grew bored. Refusing meant choosing death or bankruptcy or some combination that would destroy what remained of the family Sarah had entrusted to Michael's care. He asked what Elizabeth wanted from him beyond access to Emma. Elizabeth looked genuinely confused by the question, like the idea that she might want something from Michael hadn't occurred to her. She had money, she explained, had more money than she could spend in 3 lifetimes. What she didn't have was purpose, was the feeling that her existence mattered to anyone beyond shareholders who would replace her the moment her performance metrics declined. Saving Emma gave her that purpose. The explanation sounded sincere enough that Michael almost believed it. But he'd been poor long enough to recognize that rich people rarely gave without expecting something in return. He said as much, not accusatory but factual, laying out the power imbalance that made this negotiation inherently unequal. Elizabeth didn't argue the point, just acknowledged that yes, she held all the leverage. Yes, Michael had no real choice if he wanted to save Emma. Yes, the situation was fundamentally unfair. Then she asked what would make him feel better about accepting help he desperately needed from someone who desperately wanted to give it. Michael didn't have an answer, so instead he asked about Elizabeth's company, deflecting towards safer territory. Bennett Medical Supply, she explained, manufactured and distributed equipment to hospitals across the western United States. Ventilators, monitors, surgical tools. She'd built the business from nothing after her divorce, pouring grief from her first miscarriage into something productive. The company now employed 3,000 people, generated $2.8 billion in annual revenue. Michael listened while watching Elizabeth's hands move in small gestures that suggested nervous energy, despite the confident delivery. She was scared, he realized. Scared he'd refuse, scared she'd fail to convince him. Scared of returning to the purposeless existence where success meant nothing beyond numbers on quarterly reports. He found himself asking about her marriage, about the ex-husband who'd left her to grieve 4 children alone. Elizabeth's expression tightened. The marriage had ended after the second miscarriage, she said. Her husband wanted to move on, to accept that biological children weren't possible and explore adoption or simply remaining childless. Elizabeth couldn't stop trying, couldn't accept that her body might be permanently broken, couldn't choose her marriage over the possibility of motherhood. So he'd left, remarried within a year, had 3 healthy children with his new wife while Elizabeth spent another 4 years and $200,000 proving her first husband had been right. The bitterness in her voice made Michael flinch, recognition flooding through him. He knew that bitterness, had tasted it himself every time he saw intact families at Emma's school. Grief did that, turned other people's happiness into personal attacks. They sat in silence for a while, coffee cooling in cups neither was drinking. Michael made his decision somewhere in that quiet, not because Elizabeth had convinced him with logic, but because Emma deserved to live and pride was a luxury Michael could no longer afford. He agreed to Elizabeth's terms. She could pay for the surgery in exchange for being allowed into Emma's life in whatever capacity Emma would accept. No contracts, no formal agreements, just trust that both parties would honor their unstated obligations. Elizabeth's relief was visible enough that Michael felt embarrassed for witnessing it. She thanked him 3 times in quick succession before catching herself. Then she was asking about next steps, about when the surgery could be scheduled, about which specialists Emma should see. Michael had no answers. Dr. Walsh had provided names and recommendations, but everything cost money Michael didn't have. Elizabeth pulled out her phone, started making calls right there in the coffee shop, speaking in clipped, efficient tones. She scheduled appointments with specialists Michael had never heard of, arranged consultations at Seattle Children's Hospital with surgeons who had waiting lists measured in years, confirmed availability for procedures that typically required months of advance planning. Within 20 minutes, she'd assembled a medical team and timeline that would have taken Michael 6 months to coordinate if he'd possessed the resources at all. Michael watched this display with growing unease, recognizing that accepting Elizabeth's help meant accepting this level of intervention in decisions he'd previously made alone. The surgery, Michael had been told, would cost $180,000 and take 4 months to schedule, was apparently available next week, for whatever price Elizabeth negotiated. She finally paused, phone lowered, looking at Michael with an expression that might have been apology or defiance. "I know I'm moving too fast. I know you need time. But Emma doesn't have time. Every day we wait is another day her heart deteriorates, so yes, I'm pushing. Yes, I'm overstepping. But I'm not sorry, because being sorry won't keep your daughter alive." The words stripped away his objections, and leaving only the truth Elizabeth had just articulated. Emma was dying. Speed mattered more than process, and Michael's discomfort with accepting help was substantially less important than his daughter's survival. He nodded, surrendering control he'd never really possessed. They left the coffee shop with a plan. Emma would undergo pre-surgical testing starting Monday, meet with the surgical team on Wednesday, have the operation scheduled for the following Friday. 2 weeks from initial agreement to open-heart surgery, a timeline so compressed it made Michael dizzy to contemplate. Elizabeth promised to handle everything: paperwork, insurance negotiations, coordinating with Emma's school, even finding temporary housing near the hospital so Michael wouldn't have to commute during recovery. He should have felt grateful. Instead, he felt diminished, reduced to a bystander in his own daughter's medical emergency. Elizabeth's competence highlighted every way Michael had failed to provide adequate care, every limitation poverty had imposed. They parted in the parking lot with Elizabeth promising to email details about Monday's appointments and Michael promising to prepare Emma for the upcoming tests. He sat in his car after Elizabeth drove away in a Mercedes that probably cost more than Michael would earn in 5 years, trying to process the conversation and failing to organize his thoughts into anything coherent. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation and dread. Michael trying to explain the upcoming surgery to Emma in terms that wouldn't terrify an 8-year-old. Emma listened with solemn attention, asking questions that revealed she understood more than Michael had realized. She wanted to know if the surgery would hurt, if she'd have scars, if she'd be able to draw afterward. Michael answered as honestly as he could manage, promising the pain would be temporary and the scars would fade and her hands would work exactly the same. Emma accepted these assurances with a nod, then asked the question Michael had been dreading. "Is Miss Elizabeth paying for this because we're poor?" The bluntness stopped Michael mid-breath. "Yes," he admitted. "Yes, they were poor. Yes, Elizabeth was paying because Michael couldn't afford it. Yes, that meant they owed her something." Emma considered this while turning a graphite pencil between her fingers, one of Sarah's pencils worn smooth from years of use. Then she said something that made Michael's chest constrict. "Mom told me rich people are usually mean because having money makes them forget how to be kind. But Miss Elizabeth seems nice. Do you think Mom would like her?" Michael had no idea how to answer that question. Sarah had possessed strong opinions about wealth inequality, had believed fundamentally that extreme wealth was incompatible with ethical existence. But she also would have recognized that Elizabeth was offering Emma a chance to live. He settled for a non-answer that felt more honest than false reassurance. "I think Mom would want you to be healthy. Everything else we can figure out later." Emma seemed satisfied with this evasion, returning her attention to the sketch she'd been working on, a portrait of three people that Michael recognized as himself, Emma and Elizabeth. She was already incorporating Elizabeth into their family structure. Monday arrived with gray drizzle. Michael drove Emma to the first of what Elizabeth had promised would be comprehensive pre-surgical evaluations. The hospital campus sprawled across First Hill like a small city. Michael had been here dozens of times, knew which parking garage offered the cheapest rates and which elevator got to pediatric cardiology fastest. Elizabeth met them in the main lobby, arriving exactly on time. She'd dressed down again, jeans and a sweater. She greeted Emma first, asking about the drawing Emma had brought, admiring the latest portrait with genuine appreciation. Emma responded with easy warmth she normally reserved for Mrs. Anderson, showing Elizabeth details and techniques she'd learned from Sarah's old sketchbooks. Michael watched this interaction from 2 steps away, simultaneously grateful Emma had accepted Elizabeth so readily and disturbed by how quickly his daughter had transferred trust to someone who remained essentially a stranger. Elizabeth caught his eye over Emma's head, her expression acknowledging his concern without directly addressing it. The appointments consumed most of the day, blood work and imaging and consultations with specialists who spoke in acronyms Michael didn't understand. Elizabeth stayed for all of it, asking questions Michael wouldn't have known to ask, taking notes on her phone, translating medical jargon into language that made sense. During a break between appointments while Emma was in radiology, Elizabeth asked Michael about his work situation with careful phrasing that suggested she already knew he'd been fired. Michael saw no point in lying, told her about the termination that had happened the same day he'd stopped to help her. Elizabeth's expression tightened, guilt flashing across her face. She started to apologize. He cut her off mid-sentence. "Don't. I'd make the same choice tomorrow. Some things matter more than paychecks." The words came out with more force than Michael intended. Elizabeth went quiet, studying him with intensity that made Michael uncomfortable. Then she asked if he'd consider working for Bennett Medical Supply, not as charity but as actual employment, using his warehouse experience to help solve security problems her distribution centers were experiencing. He said he'd think about it, which was code for probably not. Elizabeth seemed to understand the subtext, nodding acceptance without pushing. They dropped the subject when Emma returned from radiology, her arm marked with injection sites and her patience wearing thin from 6 hours of being poked and prodded. Michael suggested calling it a day, but Elizabeth checked her phone and announced there was one more appointment the surgical team considered essential: a consultation with Dr. Walsh to review the test results and finalize the surgery timeline. Dr. Walsh's office occupied a corner of the cardiology wing, windows overlooking the city. She greeted them with warm professionalism. She'd reviewed all of Emma's tests, she explained, and the news was both better and worse than initial assessments had suggested. Emma's heart was deteriorating faster than anyone had predicted. They had weeks rather than months before catastrophic failure became likely. But the damage was still operable, still within the range where surgical intervention could fully correct the defects. The surgery was scheduled for Friday, 9 days away, assuming Emma's blood work came back clean. Dr. Walsh walked them through the operation in detail Michael struggled to absorb. Hours of surgery, weeks of recovery, months of cardiac rehabilitation. The risks were substantial: infection, stroke, heart failure on the operating table, but doing nothing guaranteed death within weeks. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Emma sat through this explanation without visible emotion, her pencil moving across sketch paper. She was drawing the surgery, Michael realized. The image showed a small figure on a table surrounded by larger figures in masks. Dr. Walsh noticed the drawing, asked if she could see it. Emma handed over the sketchbook without hesitation. Dr. Walsh studied the image for a long moment before speaking, her voice gentle. "You're scared. That's okay. Being scared means you understand this is serious. But I promise we're going to take care of you. All of us. Me, the surgical team, your dad, Miss Elizabeth. You're not alone in this." Emma nodded but didn't speak, just took back the sketchbook and added more shading to the figures. They left the hospital as evening settled over Seattle. Elizabeth walked them to the parking garage, promised to call tomorrow with final details about Friday, reminded Michael to contact her immediately if Emma's condition changed. Then she was gone, disappearing into her Mercedes. Emma fell asleep before they made it home. Michael carried her up 3 flights of stairs to their apartment. Mrs. Anderson intercepted them on the second-floor landing, asking about the tests and the surgery. Michael gave her the abbreviated version. Surgery Friday. Good chance of success. Everything proceeding as well as could be expected. Mrs. Anderson nodded, promised to pray, offered to watch Emma whenever Michael needed coverage. The apartment felt smaller than usual when Michael finally got Emma settled in bed. He sat at the kitchen table with paperwork Elizabeth had given him about the surgery, consent forms that required his signature acknowledging he understood the risks and accepted that Emma might die on the operating table despite everyone's best efforts. The forms reduced catastrophic possibilities to checkbox options: brain damage, paralysis, death. Michael signed everywhere marked with an X. His phone buzzed with the text from Elizabeth. "The security position is real if you want it. $65,000 base, benefits included. Start whenever you're ready." Not charity. "We genuinely have problems that need solving and your experience makes you qualified. Think about it." Michael stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide if this was genuine employment or elaborate charity. $65,000 was more than he'd made at Amazon. Came with health insurance he desperately needed. It was also a job that wouldn't exist if Elizabeth hadn't created it specifically for him. He typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on, "I'll think about it." Elizabeth replied immediately with a thumbs-up emoji, then nothing else, respecting the boundary Michael had tried to establish. The days between Monday and Friday passed in a haze of preparation and dread. He accepted Elizabeth's job offer on Wednesday, less because he'd decided it was genuine employment and more because Emma's post-surgical care would require insurance he couldn't obtain any other way. Elizabeth received his acceptance with professional courtesy, sending onboarding paperwork and a start date pushed to 3 weeks out so Michael could focus on Emma's recovery. Emma seemed calm about the approaching surgery, asking practical questions about what she could bring to the hospital and whether she'd be awake when they cut her open. Michael answered everything honestly, refusing to soften realities Emma deserved to understand. She took the information in stride, incorporating surgical details into the ongoing series of drawings she'd been creating. Thursday night, the evening before the surgery, Elizabeth came to dinner at Michael's apartment. She brought groceries Michael hadn't asked for, ingredients for a meal she insisted on cooking while Michael and Emma stayed out of the kitchen. The food was simple, roasted chicken and vegetables, but prepared with attention to detail that suggested Elizabeth had actual cooking skills beneath the wealth that made hiring chefs the easier option. They ate at the table that barely fit 3 chairs, Emma sitting between the 2 adults, chattering about school and friends and the art project she'd have to finish when she got back, assuming the surgery didn't do something to her hands. Elizabeth promised Emma that her hands would work perfectly after recovery, that the surgery wouldn't affect fine motor control or artistic ability. Emma asked how Elizabeth knew this with such certainty. Elizabeth's expression softened into something that looked like grief. "Because I asked the surgeon specifically, made him explain exactly what parts of your body would be affected and what parts would stay the same. Your hands are safe." I made sure. After dinner, Emma showed Elizabeth her latest drawings, the entire series documenting her upcoming surgery in sequential images. Elizabeth studied each sketch with the kind of attention Michael associated with professional art critics asking questions about technique and composition. She told Emma the drawings were good enough to display in galleries, that talent like this deserved formal training, that after recovery Elizabeth would connect Emma with art instructors who could help develop her abilities. Emma's eyes went wide with excitement. Michael immediately wanted to crush those hopes, because promises made to children should never involve opportunities that might disappear if circumstances changed. But Elizabeth caught his warning look and adjusted mid-sentence, clarifying that instruction would happen only if Emma wanted it, only if it felt right after recovery. Elizabeth left around 8, promising to meet them at the hospital at 6 a.m. Emma hugged her goodbye with enthusiasm that made Michael's stomach clench, already treating Elizabeth like family. He tried to warn Emma about becoming too attached, about remembering that Elizabeth had her own life and responsibilities that would eventually reclaim her attention. Emma just nodded like she understood while clearly not understanding at all. Michael put Emma to bed early, reading 3 chapters from a book about a girl who discovered she had magic powers that manifested through art. Emma fell asleep halfway through chapter 2. Michael sat beside her bed for a while after she drifted off, watching her breathe, counting heartbeats he could see in the pulse at her throat, trying to memorize this version of his daughter in case tomorrow transformed her or ended her entirely. He didn't sleep that night, just sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and reviewing consent forms and trying not to calculate probabilities. At 4 a.m., he gave up on pretending rest was possible, showered, dressed. Emma woke at 5 without needing to be called, already dressed, ready for whatever came next with brave acceptance. They arrived at Seattle Children's Hospital at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes early. Elizabeth was waiting in the lobby despite the early hour, despite surely having responsibilities that mattered more. She looked tired in a way makeup couldn't quite conceal. She handed Emma a gift bag containing new sketchbooks and a set of graphite pencils that were obviously expensive, obviously chosen to replace the worn remnants of Sarah's collection. Emma accepted the gift with delight. Michael wanted to object while simultaneously being grateful someone had thought to provide his daughter with tools that brought her comfort. Elizabeth met his eyes over Emma's head, her expression asking permission retroactively. Michael nodded acceptance. The pre-surgical process consumed an hour of forms and vital signs and final consultations. Emma handled it all with remarkable composure, answering questions directed at her, demonstrating understanding that surprised the medical staff. Elizabeth stayed close but unobtrusive, supporting without controlling. At 7 a.m., they moved Emma to the pre-op area. An anesthesiologist appeared to explain what would happen when they put Emma under. Emma listened carefully, asked if she would dream, seemed satisfied when told she'd sleep too deeply for dreams to form. Then the surgeon arrived, Dr. Rebecca Morrison, 40-something, with hands that moved with unconscious precision. She introduced herself to Emma before addressing the adults. She explained what would happen in more detail than Michael could fully process, talking about incisions and bypasses and repairs that would take 6 hours if everything went smoothly. At 7:47 a.m., they wheeled Emma toward operating room 3 while Michael signed final consent forms and tried to remember how to breathe through the crushing certainty that he'd just sent the most important person in his life into a situation he couldn't control or protect her from. Elizabeth's hand found his without asking permission, squeezing once. They waited in a family room designed for exactly this purpose. Elizabeth stayed despite having a company to run and meetings to attend. She answered emails on her phone, made quiet calls to subordinates, maintained her business empire while simultaneously being present. Michael couldn't sit still, couldn't focus on magazines or television. He paced circuits between windows and the door where someone would eventually appear with news. Elizabeth let him pace, didn't try to comfort or reassure or offer platitudes. They existed in parallel silences. Hours crawled past. 9 a.m. became 11, became 1 p.m. with no updates beyond scheduled notifications that the surgery was proceeding as expected. At 2:23 p.m., Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway, still wearing surgical scrubs marked with small bloodstains. She told them Emma had done beautifully. The repair had been successful. All major risks had been avoided. She said other things too, but Michael stopped hearing actual words somewhere around successful. Elizabeth was crying quietly, tears running down her face without acknowledgement. Michael realized he was crying too, relief and exhaustion and accumulated terror finding release. Dr. Morrison left them to compose themselves, promising someone would come get them when Emma was ready for visitors in the ICU. Eventually, Elizabeth broke the silence, her voice raw. "Thank you for letting me be here, for trusting me with something this important." Michael didn't know how to respond to that gratitude, so he just said, "She's alive. That's all that matters. Everything else we can figure out later." At 3:15 p.m., a nurse appeared to escort them to the ICU where Emma lay unconscious, tubes and wires connecting her small body to machines that monitored every biological function. Michael stood beside the bed holding Emma's hand carefully, watching her chest rise and fall with mechanical precision, counting breaths and heartbeats. Elizabeth stood on the opposite side of the bed, her hand resting lightly on Emma's arm in a gesture that claimed connection without demanding exclusivity. They maintained that vigil through the evening as Emma's unconsciousness gradually lightened toward something that might eventually become wakefulness. At 8:47 p.m., exactly 13 hours after Emma had disappeared into surgery, her eyes opened halfway and found Michael immediately. She tried to speak but couldn't around the breathing tube, managing only a small sound that communicated awareness. Michael leaned close, whispered that she'd done great, that the surgery was over, that she was safe. Emma's eyes drifted to Elizabeth, recognition flickering before exhaustion pulled her back under. But before she slipped away, she did something that made Michael's chest tighten. She turned her hand palm up in Elizabeth's direction. Elizabeth accepted by closing her fingers gently around Emma's in a gesture that looked almost like family. "Đây là phần ba, phần cuối." Emma spent 11 days in the ICU before doctors cleared her for transfer to a standard recovery room. 11 days of Michael sleeping in a chair that reclined exactly 43 degrees and waking every time a monitor beeped. Or Emma made sounds that might have been pain or might have been dreams processing trauma her conscious mind couldn't yet articulate. Elizabeth appeared every morning at 7 and stayed until visiting hours ended at 9 p.m., managing her company through phone calls made in stairwells and emails sent from the family lounge, maintaining presence that Michael initially resented and eventually stopped noticing because consistency transformed novelty into routine. The transfer to recovery came on a Tuesday morning. Emma finally strong enough to breathe without supplemental oxygen, her repaired heart maintaining rhythm without chemical assistance, her chest incision healing in a line of surgical staples that would leave a scar she'd carry forever. The new room had windows overlooking the city instead of walls designed for maximum efficiency during medical emergencies. Emma could sit up without triggering alarms, could eat solid food, could hold pencils Elizabeth kept replacing whenever the graphite wore down to unusable nubs. She drew obsessively during recovery, filling the sketchbooks Elizabeth had given her with images that documented everything her 8-year-old perception could capture. Nurses who smiled too much, machines that beeped at irregular intervals, the view from her window showing a Seattle she'd never seen from this angle. She drew Michael sleeping in the chair with his mouth open, captured Elizabeth reading emails with an expression that suggested displeasure, created portraits of Dr. Morrison and Dr. Walsh and every medical professional who'd participated in keeping her alive. Elizabeth commissioned a proper display for the sketches, bringing frames and hanging wire and mounting the best pieces on the walls of Emma's room despite hospital regulations that technically prohibited patient decoration. Nurses pretended not to notice this violation, charmed by Emma's talent or intimidated by Elizabeth's presence, or simply unwilling to enforce rules that served no purpose beyond bureaucratic consistency. The room transformed from sterile medical space into something resembling a gallery, making the unbearable slightly more bearable through the alchemy of creation. Michael started at Bennett Medical Supply 2 weeks after Emma's surgery, beginning employment at a company his daughter's heart surgeon indirectly kept in business through equipment purchases. The security position Elizabeth had created existed in that ambiguous space between legitimate need and elaborate charity. Distribution centers genuinely experienced theft. Michael genuinely possessed relevant experience, but the timing and salary suggested Elizabeth had shaped the role specifically to accommodate circumstances. The work proved surprisingly demanding, requiring Michael to audit security protocols across 6 facilities scattered between Seattle and Portland, identifying vulnerabilities that employees with more tenure had learned to ignore. He found problems everywhere: loading dock cameras positioned to miss blind spots, inventory systems that trusted self-reporting without verification, night shifts supervised by managers who spent more time sleeping than monitoring. Michael documented everything in reports that probably read more critically than Elizabeth expected. But incompetent security served nobody's interests, and Michael refused to accept a paycheck for pretending problems didn't exist. Elizabeth read his first report during a site visit to the Tacoma Distribution Center, her expression shifting from professional interest to something resembling surprise. She looked at him over the tablet. "You don't pull punches. That's refreshing. Most people I employ spend more energy telling me what they think I want to hear than identifying what actually needs fixing." Michael shrugged, uncomfortable with praise. "You're paying me to find problems. Seems dishonest to pretend they don't exist just because acknowledging them creates work." She implemented every recommendation from his first report, authorized the budget for security upgrades without hesitation, fired the managers whose negligence had cost her company thousands. Word spread quickly through Bennett Medical Supply that the new security consultant had the CEO's ear and the authority to make changes. Michael became simultaneously respected and resented, valued for competence while being suspected of leveraging personal connections to advance faster than merit alone would justify. The suspicions weren't entirely wrong. Michael's relationship with Elizabeth existed in a category that resisted simple classification. Not friendship because friendship implied equality they didn't possess. Not romance because neither had expressed interest. Not family despite Emma's increasingly visible attachment. Elizabeth occupied space in their lives that had no name, filling gaps Michael hadn't realized existed until someone appeared to fill them. Emma's recovery progressed faster than doctors had predicted, her young body healing with the efficiency that made pediatric surgery viable. 4 weeks post-operation, she could walk hospital corridors without assistance. 6 weeks. She was climbing stairs that made Michael's chest tighten with fear she'd fall and undo repairs that had cost $180,000. 8 weeks after the operation, doctors cleared her for discharge with instructions about cardiac rehabilitation and activity restrictions and ongoing medication. Elizabeth offered her house for Emma's continued recovery, a 5-bedroom estate in Medina with views of Lake Washington and enough space that Michael and Emma could occupy an entire wing without encountering Elizabeth if they preferred privacy. The offer came packaged as practical logistics, closer to Seattle Children's for follow-up appointments. On-site staff who could help with Emma's care. Michael heard the subtext underneath. Elizabeth wanted them close, wanted continued access to the child who'd given her life purpose. He refused the house, chose instead a two-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill that cost more than his previous place but was still substantially less than what Elizabeth would have charged if she'd charged anything at all for the Medina estate. The new apartment came with working heat and windows that actually sealed against rain and a kitchen large enough that two people could occupy it simultaneously. Michael signed a lease that stretched his new salary in ways that made budgeting tight but manageable, claiming independence that probably looked like ingratitude. Elizabeth accepted the refusal without visible disappointment, just arranged for medical equipment delivery to the Capitol Hill address and coordinated with physical therapists who'd make house calls 3 times weekly. She didn't stop visiting, didn't reduce her presence just because Michael had declined to move into her house. She appeared at the new apartment bearing groceries and takeout, and small gifts for Emma, that Michael stopped objecting to after the 15th time because refusing every gesture made him feel petty. Emma thrived in the new space, claiming the second bedroom and decorating it with drawings that documented her surgical recovery and the strange new configuration their family had assumed. She drew Elizabeth more frequently than she drew Michael now, capturing the woman in dozens of poses. Elizabeth laughing at something Emma had said, Elizabeth concentrating on her phone, Elizabeth sleeping in the hospital chair during the weeks when visiting hours had been suggestions rather than rules. He tried to establish boundaries around how often Elizabeth could visit, suggesting that 3 times weekly was reasonable for someone who wasn't family. Elizabeth agreed to the limitation without argument, then continued showing up 5 or 6 times weekly with excuses about being in the neighborhood or having extra food or wanting to drop off books Emma had mentioned wanting to read. Michael recognized the pattern. He was being outmaneuvered by someone with more resources and fewer compunctions about using them. The concession came gradually, Michael's resistance eroding under sustained pressure from a daughter who kept asking why Miss Elizabeth couldn't come over more often, and from his own exhaustion at maintaining boundaries that served principle more than any practical purpose. By Emma's 10th week of recovery, Elizabeth had a key to the apartment and permission to visit whenever she wanted. Conditions Michael imposed only to maintain the illusion that he controlled access to his own living space. Work provided escape from complications Michael couldn't solve, giving him problems with clear solutions and metrics that measured success in quantifiable terms. He spent 40 hours weekly at Bennett Medical Supply Facilities, plus another 10 reviewing security footage and analyzing theft patterns. The job consumed energy that might otherwise have been directed toward processing the ways his life had transformed, offering distraction that felt increasingly necessary. Elizabeth ran her company with the same intensity Michael brought to securing it, though her responsibilities operated at a scale that made his concerns about loading dock cameras seem almost quaint. She managed 3,000 employees, negotiated contracts worth tens of millions, made decisions that affected hospital capabilities across 11 Western states. Michael occasionally attended executive meetings when security concerns intersected with corporate strategy, sitting at tables where people discussed budgets larger than he'd earn in a lifetime, watching Elizabeth operate with casual competence that came from years of practice. She was brilliant at it, reading people in situations with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural, identifying solutions to problems others hadn't recognized existed, maintaining authority without resorting to domineering aggression. Employees respected her. Vendors negotiated carefully. Hospital administrators took her calls immediately because Bennett Medical Supply had become essential infrastructure. Watching her work taught Michael things about leadership that 12 years in warehouses hadn't conveyed. But she was also lonely in ways that $3 billion couldn't solve. Isolated by success that had cost her marriage and biological children and any relationship that wasn't mediated through corporate hierarchies. Michael recognized the pattern because he'd lived a version of it himself, Grief had isolated him, poverty had isolated him, single parenthood had isolated him until Elizabeth had appeared offering help that came packaged with desperate need for purpose that mirrored his own desperate need for resources. They'd found each other through mutual desperation, had constructed an arrangement that benefited both parties even if the benefits weren't equivalent. 3 months into Emma's recovery, Elizabeth started talking about the future with specificity that suggested she'd been planning this conversation for weeks. They should consider formalizing their arrangement, she suggested one evening while the three of them ate dinner. Emma needed stability, needed to know that the people she'd come to depend on weren't going to disappear when the immediate crisis passed. Elizabeth could help provide that stability, not through money alone, but through presence, through commitment, through being someone Emma could count on. The proposal arrived dressed in practical language, but Michael heard the emotional plea. Elizabeth wanted to be part of their family permanently, wanted legal or social recognition that she belonged beyond temporary arrangement. She was asking for something Michael didn't know how to give, didn't know if he wanted to give, didn't know if Sarah would have approved. He deflected with logistics questions about what formalization would mean legally. Elizabeth met his deflection with specifics. She could establish a trust for Emma's ongoing medical care, and future education could be named as Emma's godparent or guardian if something happened to Michael, could have visitation rights formalized so that Emma's access to her wasn't subject to Michael's moods or changing circumstances. Emma listened to this conversation with focused attention that suggested she understood the stakes, even if the legal vocabulary exceeded her comprehension. When Elizabeth finished and Michael had run out of deflecting questions, Emma spoke with blunt honesty. "I want Miss Elizabeth to stay. I don't care about trusts or guards or whatever the grown-up words are. I just don't want her to go away like Mom did. Can we make her stay?" The question landed like a physical blow, exposing the fear Emma had been carrying. Everyone Emma loved eventually left. Michael had no answer that would satisfy an 8-year-old's need for certainty. No way to promise that Elizabeth would stay without ceding control over his family's composition. He looked at Elizabeth, trying to read whether this was manipulation or genuine commitment. Elizabeth met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not going anywhere unless you make me leave. I know you're scared of depending on me, scared I'll get bored or find someone else or decide this was a mistake. I'm scared too. Scared you'll decide I'm overstepping, scared Emma will realize I'm not her real mother and reject me, scared I'm building my entire emotional foundation on a relationship that exists because your daughter almost died. But fear doesn't change the fact that I love her, that I love both of you, that this feels more like family than anything I've experienced in the 6 years since I accepted my body would never give me biological children." The declaration arrived without preamble or qualification. Just raw honesty about emotions Michael had suspected, but Elizabeth had never explicitly stated. She loved them, not hypothetically or conditionally, but actually presently, in ways that demanded response Michael wasn't prepared to give. He'd spent 3 years protecting himself from exactly this kind of vulnerability, building walls around the space Sarah's death had created. Elizabeth was asking him to dismantle those walls, to accept that love was possible after loss. Emma was watching him with expectation written across her face, waiting for Michael to decide whether the family she'd already accepted in her heart could become official. Michael felt the weight of that expectation like physical pressure, felt Sarah's absence like a presence that demanded he honor the third promise. Find love again if you meet someone worthy. Elizabeth wasn't what Sarah had meant when extracting that promise. Sarah had been imagining another woman who'd love Michael, who'd give Emma a stepmother. She hadn't been imagining a billionaire CEO who'd decided to love Emma first. But maybe Sarah hadn't been specific because details didn't matter compared to the underlying instruction. Don't let grief make you so hard you can't accept love when it appears. Elizabeth loved Emma. That much was undeniable from months of showing up and staying present and caring about a child who wasn't hers. Whether she loved Michael or was performing love to maintain access to Emma mattered less than whether accepting her presence would make Emma happier, healthier, more capable of becoming whoever she was meant to become. Michael made his decision somewhere in the silence that followed Elizabeth's confession, chose surrender over continued resistance because the alternative was teaching Emma that walls were more important than people. He didn't have words adequate to match Elizabeth's declaration, didn't know how to articulate feelings that remained tangled and complicated. So instead he just said, "Okay, you can stay. We'll figure out the legal stuff later. For now, just stay." Emma's relief was immediate and visible, tension draining from her small frame. Elizabeth's eyes went bright with what might have been tears, except she didn't let them fall. She nodded acceptance, didn't push for elaboration or clarification. Just accepted what he'd offered and let the moment settle. The apartment felt different after that conversation, walls expanding to accommodate 3 people instead of 2. Elizabeth started keeping clothes in the second bathroom, toiletries that accumulated despite her having a house 10 minutes away. Her presence transformed from visit to residence, evenings bleeding into mornings when she'd fall asleep on the couch and wake to make breakfast. The transition happened gradually enough that Michael couldn't identify when Elizabeth stopped being a guest and became something else. Something that looked enough like family that Emma started occasionally calling her mom in moments of distraction before correcting to Miss Elizabeth. 5 months after Emma's surgery, Dr. Walsh cleared her for full activity resumption with ongoing monitoring but no restrictions beyond common sense. Emma could run, could climb, could participate in PE class and playground activities. Emma celebrated by demanding they visit the Space Needle, a promise Elizabeth had made during the early hospital days. The 3 of them made the trip on a Saturday morning, riding the elevator to the observation deck while Emma pressed against the window watching the city shrink beneath them. She sketched the view from multiple angles, filling pages with attempted captures of perspective that challenged her developing skills. Elizabeth stood beside her, offering suggestions about vanishing points and horizon lines, explaining concepts from art classes she'd taken before business school had redirected her trajectory. Michael watched them together, dark head and lighter head bent over sketchbook, hands pointing at the same architectural features, voices overlapping in the way family voices overlapped. They looked like mother and daughter despite sharing no genetic material, looked like people who belonged together. The observation struck Michael with unexpected force, recognition that Emma had gained something through her surgery beyond a functioning heart. She'd gained a mother figure who'd chosen her deliberately. Elizabeth loved Emma in ways that weren't diminished by lack of genetic connection. That choice meant something Michael was only beginning to understand, something about how family got created through commitment rather than just inherited through blood. 6 months after the surgery, Michael found courage to ask Elizabeth what she actually wanted from this arrangement beyond access to Emma. They were alone in his apartment, Emma asleep in the bedroom. Elizabeth considered the question with careful thought she brought to complex business problems. What she wanted, she finally explained, was to stop living in the provisional space where everything depended on Michael's continued tolerance. She wanted to know if there was a future where she belonged, not just because Emma needed her, but because Michael wanted her, where her role wasn't contingent on being useful but recognized as valuable in ways that went beyond money and resources. She was asking if Michael could ever love her the way she'd come to love him. Not as caregiver or provider, but as partner, as someone who'd choose to build a life together even if circumstances hadn't forced them into proximity. The question hung between them like something physical, demanding response. Michael wasn't sure he could give honestly because his feelings had become too tangled to separate Elizabeth, who saved Emma, from Elizabeth, who showed up every day, from Elizabeth, who made him feel less alone. He didn't know if what he felt was love or gratitude or just exhausted relief that someone competent had arrived to help carry burdens. He told her as much, admitted he couldn't confidently distinguish between emotions that all seemed to produce the same outcome. He wanted her present, wanted her involved, wanted to stop questioning whether her commitment was sustainable when she'd already proven it through months of consistency. Elizabeth accepted this ambiguous answer with grace, not pushing for more certainty than Michael could provide, just acknowledging that uncertainty was honest and honesty mattered more than false promises. They could keep moving forward in the provisional space they currently occupied, she suggested. Could let their relationship develop without forcing it to become something either had to define before they were ready. Michael agreed to those terms, relieved Elizabeth wasn't demanding declarations he couldn't make. They existed for a while in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that only worked between people who'd grown accustomed to each other's presence. Then Elizabeth asked if he'd considered the godparent question, whether he'd be comfortable formalizing her role through legal documentation that would ensure continuity if something happened to Michael. The question forced Michael to confront mortality he'd been avoiding since Sarah's death had taught him that 30-year-old mothers could die. He was 38 now, healthy enough but working a job where accidents happened and driving routes where collisions happened. Emma deserved protection from that possibility, deserved assurance that losing her father wouldn't mean losing everything else too. Making Elizabeth Emma's legal guardian required acknowledging that their relationship had evolved beyond temporary arrangement into something permanent enough to build legal structures around. It required trusting that Elizabeth's commitment wouldn't evaporate if circumstances changed. It required believing that Elizabeth loved Emma enough to become her mother if biology and tragedy made that transformation necessary. Michael said yes without fully processing the implications, just recognized that this was the right choice. Elizabeth accepted his agreement calmly, promised to arrange the legal paperwork, didn't make a production of the moment even though it represented a threshold they'd just crossed. The paperwork arrived 2 weeks later, dense legal documents that reduced emotional complexity to standardized clauses about custody and decision-making authority. He signed everywhere marked with sticky arrows, watched Elizabeth sign as well, filed copies in the fireproof box where he kept Emma's birth certificate. The signatures made official what had already been true. Elizabeth had become Emma's second mother, chosen rather than biological, earning her place through action rather than inheriting it through reproduction. Emma knew nothing about the guardianship papers, was simply told that Miss Elizabeth would be listed as someone who could make decisions about her welfare if emergencies happened and Michael wasn't available. She accepted this information with a nod, unbothered by legalities that mattered enormously to adults. 7 months post-surgery, Emma returned to Garfield Elementary with medical clearances that allowed full participation. She'd missed most of 2nd grade, had been homeschooled through a combination of hospital tutors and Elizabeth's willingness to teach subjects she remembered from decades past. The return came with anxieties about falling behind peers or being marked as different because of the surgical scar visible above her collar. Elizabeth solved this problem with characteristic directness, showing Emma her own scars from the 4 procedures that had followed her miscarriages. Surgical interventions that had left marks Elizabeth usually concealed but now revealed to demonstrate that everyone carried evidence of trauma survived. The gesture was intimate in ways that made Michael uncomfortable witnessing it. But Emma responded with visible relief, touching Elizabeth's scars and then her own, understanding that marks didn't mean broken, just meant you'd fought battles that required medical intervention. School went better than Michael had feared. Emma integrating back into routines with the resilience children demonstrated when adults didn't make transitions more dramatic than necessary. Her artistic talent earned immediate recognition from teachers who'd never encountered an 8-year-old with her technical skill, leading to recommendations for accelerated art programs that Elizabeth immediately offered to fund. Michael accepted this offer with less resistance than he'd have shown months earlier, recognizing that refusing support when it genuinely benefited Emma served Michael's pride more than his daughter's interests. The art classes transformed Emma's already impressive abilities into something approaching professional competence. Private instruction from teachers who'd spent careers studying technique Emma absorbed with hungry enthusiasm. She produced work that belonged in galleries rather than elementary school hallways. Elizabeth had prints made of Emma's best pieces, framed and hung them throughout the apartment they now all effectively shared. 8 months after the surgery, Michael and Elizabeth attended Emma's school art show, where her work occupied a full wall of the gymnasium. Parents and teachers crowded around Emma's display, commenting on skill that exceeded expectations, asking questions about training and influence. Emma fielded these questions with poise that reminded Michael of Sarah, the same confidence tempered by awareness that talent alone didn't guarantee success. Elizabeth stood beside Emma during the exhibition, answering questions about her role with carefully vague explanations that satisfied curiosity without revealing full complexity. Michael watched them together, saw how naturally Elizabeth had assumed the maternal position, how easily Emma accepted that assumption. They looked like family. They were family, Michael acknowledged. The show ended with promises from gallery owners that Emma should contact them when she had pieces ready for commercial display. Elizabeth accepted the cards with gracious professionalism, made no commitments beyond promising to consider opportunities when Emma was older. Driving home afterward, Emma asleep in the back seat, exhausted from hours of social performance, Michael asked Elizabeth what she'd told people when they'd asked about her relationship to Emma. Elizabeth's answer came quiet. I told them I was her mother, because that's what I am, even if biology and paperwork tell different stories. Michael could have objected, could have insisted that mother was a title Sarah had earned and Elizabeth was something else. Instead, he just nodded, accepting the claim because fighting it served no purpose beyond protecting a boundary that had already been crossed months ago. That night, after Emma had been tucked into bed and Elizabeth had retreated to the second bedroom that had become hers, Michael sat alone, considering the shape his life had taken since stopping to help a stranger 8 months prior. He'd lost a job, gained a better one. He'd accepted charity he'd sworn never to take, discovered it wasn't charity when offered by someone who needed to give as desperately as Michael had needed to receive. He'd watched his daughter nearly die and then recover and then thrive. He'd built a family from pieces that shouldn't have fit together but had anyway. Sarah's voice in his memory softer now than in the first year after her death. Find love again if you meet someone worthy. I give you permission. Michael had been interpreting that instruction narrowly, assuming Sarah meant romantic love specifically. But maybe Sarah had meant something broader. Any love that made life more bearable, any connection that helped him honor the promise to keep Emma safe without destroying himself through isolation. Elizabeth offered that kind of love, had been offering it for months while Michael resisted accepting what was already obviously true. He loved her. Not the same way he'd loved Sarah, not with the intensity of first love that hadn't yet learned about mortality. But he loved her anyway, in ways that felt more sustainable precisely because they acknowledged that nothing was permanent, and commitment mattered more when you chose it despite uncertainty. Michael made a decision in that midnight quiet, chose to stop resisting what had already become inevitable. Tomorrow he'd tell Elizabeth what he'd realized tonight, would acknowledge that she'd become essential to his life and Emma's life in ways that went beyond gratitude. He'd risk vulnerability that terrified him, would choose connection over isolation. He'd honor Sarah's third promise by accepting that Elizabeth was someone worthy of love, someone who'd earned the right to be part of their family through 8 months of showing up. The decision settled over him like relief, permission to stop fighting what he actually wanted. Elizabeth was still alive, was here now, had proven through consistent action that her commitment wasn't contingent on convenient circumstances. That was enough. It had to be enough, because the alternative was teaching Emma that walls were more important than people and safety mattered more than joy. Michael stood, checked on Emma one final time, found her sleeping peacefully, found the graphite pencil still clutched in her hand, found evidence of healing that made every compromise and concession worth whatever it had cost him to accept help. Then he walked down the hall to the second bedroom where Elizabeth slept, knocked quietly, waited for her sleepy voice to grant permission to enter. She sat up when he came in, concern crossing her face, obviously worried something had happened with Emma. Michael sat on the edge of the bed, tried to find words adequate to explain what he'd realized, settled for simple honesty. I love you, not just because you saved Emma, because you stayed after saving her, because you keep showing up even when it's hard, because you love my daughter like she's yours. I don't know if I'm ready for everything that might mean, but I know I don't want you to leave. I know I want to build whatever this is into something permanent if you're willing to risk that I might be terrible at it. Elizabeth's eyes went bright with tears she didn't try to hide, reaching for Michael's hand and holding it like she was afraid he might disappear. I'm willing to risk it. I'm willing to risk everything because you and Emma have become my family in ways that matter more than biology or conventional structures. We'll figure out what it means together. No rush, no pressure, just commitment to showing up and staying present even when it's difficult. Michael leaned forward, kissed her for the first time with intention rather than accident, tasted salt from tears that belonged to both of them. Felt something unlock in his chest that had been sealed since Sarah's death. This was different from what he'd had with Sarah. Less certain, more complicated, built on foundations that included trauma and grief and desperate need that made sustainability questionable. But it was real, was present, was something he'd chosen rather than something circumstance had forced him to accept. That choice mattered. Transformed obligation into commitment and necessity into desire. They sat together in the quiet that followed, hands linked, futures uncertain but present moments sufficient in ways that made uncertainty bearable. Through the wall they could hear Emma's soft breathing, evidence of life sustained through medical intervention and Elizabeth's willingness to love someone else's child, and Michael's capacity to accept help when accepting it meant abandoning pride that had become more burden than protection. They'd become a family through crisis. Were choosing to remain a family through commitment. Were building something that might last if they could navigate the complications. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, logistics to arrange, feelings to articulate, structures to formalize. But tonight, in the apartment they shared and the life they were building together, Michael allowed himself to believe that Sarah's third promise had been kept, that love was possible after loss, that family could be chosen as well as inherited. Elizabeth had proven worthy through 8 months of showing up. Now Michael just had to prove worthy of what she'd offered, a future built on connection rather than isolation, on trust rather than self-protection, on the radical belief that opening yourself to loss was the only way to access joy.